computer. Okay, welcome to the Hoshivar and the Ladder of Wisdom podcast. I am glad to welcome you to another interview session. Today I have with me my dear colleague and best friend, Tannaz. Tannaz is a psychologist and is currently a postdoc in clinical psychology. I'm a biologist majoring in molecular and medical genetics and currently working as a senior scientist in a biotech company in the field of cell and gene therapy. Both of us are very honored to host our prominent guest, Professor Robert Plomin. Just to give a brief introduction to our guest, Professor Plomin is a world-leading behavioral geneticist. He is a professor of behavioral genetics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, King's College, London. His research focuses on the learning abilities and disabilities using quantitative and molecular genetics techniques. He directs one of the world's premier twin studies, the Twin Early Development Study called TED, which has followed up over 10,000 twins pairs since birth in 1994, 1996, up to the present day. He has published more than 800 scientific papers and is the author and co-author of several books, including G for Genes, The Impact of Genetics on Education and Achievement, published in 2013, Behavioral Genetics, 2017, 7th edition. This is the best-selling textbook in the field of behavioral genetics, and Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, published in 2018, which we will discuss mostly about this book today. Blueprint is a game-changing book by a leader in the field. It shows how DNA present in a single cell with which we are all begin our lives can impact our behavior as adults. Blueprint has received commendable media attention, featured in publications and podcasts such as Guardian, the Psychology Podcast, Daily Bail, and BBC Radio, among others. To the best of my knowledge, this book has not been translated into Farsi, but I had the opportunity and privilege to summarize and explain it in one of the episodes of Hoshivar's podcast in Farsi, in Persian language. I will include a link to both the Amazon if you want to purchase this book, and also the Hoshivar episode in the YouTube description if you want to refer. But before I continue my introduction, I would like to read Professor Steven Pinker's comment about this book. Steven Pinker is the professor of psychology at Harvard University and the author of the best-selling books, The Blank State and Enlightenment Now. So it has been printed in the top of the book. This is a book that we are going to discuss. So he says, a clear and engaging, let me have my eyeglass, sorry. A clear and engaging explanation of one of the hottest and most interesting fields in science by its most distinguished practitioner, which is Professor Plomin. Professor Plomin believes that inherited DNA differences are the major systematic force that makes us who we are as individuals. Our cognitive abilities, our disabilities, our mental health, illness, and even personalities. The environment is important, but it works differently from what we thought. These advances in genetic research, Professor Plomin believes, call for a radical rethink about what makes us who we are, with sweeping and no doubt controversial, we will cover part of these implications for the way we think about parenting, about education, and events that shapes our lives. We will try to cover these topics, but we got a promise from Professor Plomin that we have a follow-up session if we cannot cover all these topics. At the last part of the introduction, Professor Plomin has received numerous awards for his research. He is a fellow of the Association of Psychological Science, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Academy of the Medical Sciences, and British Academy. Professor Plomin has also been featured in the Times 2019 list of 25 top thinkers. Professor Plomin was ranked among the 100 most eminent psychologists in the history of science. Without further delay, let's go to the interview that I'm sure we all will enjoy. Both me and Tanner again welcome you, Professor Plomin, to this interview. Do you have any comments before we start the question?
Well, just thank you very much for inviting me. I don't think I've talked to any people from representing Iran at all before, so it's interesting to be able to talk to that audience, because I really don't know where your audience would be coming from in terms of these issues about genes and environment. So it'd be fun for me too.
Thank you so much, Professor Plomin. So I think just we didn't mention here that both of the podcasts, especially the Ladder of Wisdom that we are producing with Tanaz and another colleague, we are aiming to find the root cause of some of the bad behaviors and good behaviors of human, considering psychology, genetics, evolution, because we think the more awareness we can give to Iranian people, so the better we can make a change, the situation in Iran that we have. We think maybe it's a best to increase the awareness from cultural perspective and also scientific perspective. Okay, so for the first question, but it has two parts, Robert. So what is the behavioral genetics in the first place, and why it has received more attention during after the completion of Human Genome Project in 2003 by psychologists around the world? This is the first question, that what is the behavioral genetics and why it's important? And the second part, what do you consider the most significant findings in the field during the last few decades since you started your research career on twins in Colorado on TED's project? So it's like a two parts, if you can cover both of them, please.
Well, behavioral genetics is as it says, it's the genetic study of behavior. And behavior is usually the domain of psychology, but we talk about it very broadly as kind of complex human functioning, really. And so that's important because that's a lot of who we are, so that has to do with our mental health and illness, our personality, our cognitive abilities. So it just has broad appeal to people. And but it isn't a special field. It's genetics applied to behavioral traits, just as you primarily study more biological traits or medical traits, for example. So it's just genetics as applied to this domain of behavior. And unlike some of the things you study, Mehdi, is there's single gene disorders, like when you're talking about gene replacement or gene editing, you're talking about things that have a very major impact from one gene. But the one thing we've learned about behavioral genetics as we moved into the DNA era is that there are very few examples of that for complex traits. Many of them will have, like alcoholism or obesity, they'll have one rare form of obesity, say, that's caused by a single gene. But the vast majority, 98%, say, of the problems with obesity aren't due to a single gene, but they're heavily influenced by genetics, more than most people would, assume. And that's what we're studying here, is sort of genetic and environmental influences on complex traits. And the second part of your question, the reason it's taken off so much is because up until almost the 1970s or so, psychology was really dominated by what I call environmentalism. That is, the view that we are what we learn. Perfectly reasonable, like why do some kids do better at school than others? Maybe their parents just gave them a better start, taught them vocabulary, that sort of thing. Why are some people schizophrenic and others not? For a long time, including when I began in graduate school in the 1970s, the textbooks would tell you that schizophrenia was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. A lot of it was to do with mother blaming, and that was really wicked because you wouldn't find out that your child, first of all, about 1% of the population throughout the world is in their life diagnosed as schizophrenic. That's huge in terms of medical risk. But you don't find out about that, whether your child, say, is schizophrenic, until they're in their late teens or early 20s. And then can you imagine being told that the reason is what you did to the child in the first few years of life? because you can't go back and change that. And the worst part about it is it's totally wrong. There's absolutely no evidence for that. And in contrast, there's very strong evidence for genetics. So psychology has gone from just ignoring genetics altogether and really disavowing it, in part because of, 100 years ago, psychology took off as a science, but it was called behaviorism. It had to do with just no more philosophy, introspection, but rather studying overt behavior. And most of that was animal studies. And so you can show in experimental studies that you can manipulate rats' environments and make big changes. If you shock them for doing certain things, they won't do that thing. But that doesn't mean that the causes of individual differences in rats, like why are some schizophrenic and why are some less good at learning mazes, that's not to say the environment causes those differences. It's an open question. But in psychology, we know that things run in families. Schizophrenia runs in families, obesity runs in families, reading disability runs in families. And so for that reason, it wasn't unreasonable to think that characteristics run in families for reasons of nurture, that is family environment, rather than nature, by which I mean genetic differences. But once you start realizing, well, maybe genetics is important, you realize that parents and offspring are 50% similar genetically. So you can reinterpret a lot of these correlations between what parents do and what children do as possibly genetically influenced. So for example, with schizophrenia, perhaps, parents are schizophrenic, their children experience an environment that makes them schizophrenic, but it's also possible that it's genetic in the sense that even if the kids weren't reared with their biological parents in an adoption design, they would be just as likely to become schizophrenic. And we now know that. And so as this evidence started piling up, that not only is there significant genetic influence, but it's very substantial. There's a famous paper that did a meta-analysis of something like 3,000 twin studies that have been reported on something like 15 million pairs of twins around the world. And on average, all these traits, including biological traits, blood pressure, that sort of thing, physical traits, height and weight, as well as psychological traits, about 50% of the differences between people are due to inherited DNA differences, which is what we mean by nature, genetics. So that's only 50%, it's not 100%. But in psychology, it's very rare that we explain 5% of the variance with anything you can name. And they're significant, but they're not substantial effects. So 50%, explaining 50% of the variance with inherited DNA differences is just off the scale of the power of findings in psychology, where 5% would be considered a very big deal. So I think that's what's taken things by storm. And just in the late 1900s, when the DNA revolution was starting to get going, people began to say, well, instead of thinking that genetics has nothing to do with psychology, to realize it's a very powerful influence in psychology. So I think the field was primed for the DNA revolution that allowed us to go beyond twin and adoption studies to look for the actual genes that affect these traits. So just in summary there, psychology has gone from the 1970s, assuming that nothing is heritable, that is, nothing in psychology is due to genetic influence, to the point now where we can say there's a challenge. Find any trait in psychology that is not influenced by genetics. You cannot find a reliably measured trait that shows no genetic influence. And on average, psychological traits are about 50% heritable. And that means they go from 40% for personality to about 60% for cognitive abilities. But 40%, 60%, the real point is that's a tremendous amount of explanatory power due to genetics. And it's exciting because people ignored it for so long. And the reason I give public lectures and I like to do podcasts like this is people still don't really get it. Parents of newborn kids, they almost can't help but feel that they're totally responsible for the way their child turns out. And in my book, Blueprint, the 7 pages or so on parenting have more attention than anything else, because I say genetics is a lot more important than you think. And that can be very good for parents if, say, in late adolescence, their child becomes schizophrenic, or earlier in life, their child's autistic. These are highly heritable characteristics. So instead of saying, as we did 20 years ago, if your child's autistic, they actually had a thing where they called the mother, the refrigerator mother. The reason the child was autistic, I'm sure your listeners know what autism is. Instead of, they just assumed that it was due to mothering, and the mothers were cold. And so that they assumed caused the kids to be autistic. But if you've ever worked with autistic children, if you were just regular la-di-da-di-da, loving, and everything, it would be weird, because these children are not reacting normally. And so if you try to go with where they're at, where they won't look at you, for example, you might look to an outside observer as if you're not being very affectionate, but you could actually be abusive if you were too affectionate, because they don't want to be held. They don't, if you try to go around, look in their eyes, make them look in your eyes, it's very uncomfortable for them. So that's an example of where it's so easy to accept correlations between what parents do and what their children become as environmental. Every week I can find something in the newspaper where if parents do X, the kids become Y. And if people get anything out of this podcast, what would be best for them to get out of it is to just always ask, yeah, but what about genetics? So the next time you read, parents who read a lot to their kids have kids who read better when they go to school. Very reasonable to say, well, sure, that's environmental. Yeah. But what about genetics? And it turns out that almost all of these correlations can be explained substantially by genetics. And this is not to say there's no environmental influence. It's not to say parents have no effect on their kids. Parents can control their kids' behavior. This is such an important point, that if you're, it doesn't mean you just throw up your hand and say, oh, I can't do anything. So if your kid's running around, beating up other kids, being obnoxious, when people come over to visit or something. No, that's not what this means. As a parent, you should be controlling your child, that you're the adult, they're the child. But it doesn't mean you're going to make a difference in the long run. So if your child, say, is very aggressive or whatever, you can control that behavior. And as long as that control is there, as an adult, you ought to be able to damp down that behavior. But it doesn't mean that you will make your child less aggressive out there in the world where you don't have that control. And in fact, a lot of what aggressiveness is in childhood is maybe a positive thing in the vicious world of business and competitiveness and all of that. Maybe you need to be a bit aggressive, who knows? But the point I'm making is parents matter. Children can't survive without parents, and parents need to help their children, I think, become who they are. So the thing I'm against is parents saying, having just gone through the Olympics, I want my child to be a 400-meter Olympic gold star winner. That sounds very stupid, because there you realize, unless the child has the physical constitution, that's pretty unrealistic. You could get your child to be a much faster sprinter, but that doesn't mean they're going to get into world-class competition. So if parents think of themselves more as resource managers, that is, find out what your child likes to do and help them do that. It's a lot better recipe for parenting than, as many of us do, and it sounds silly when you say it baldly like this, but a lot of us just have these ideas of what we want our child to be. And if they don't, and so we push them in that direction. And what we should be doing is doing things because we love them and we want life to be nice for them. So if your child's aggressive, that's not going to be good for them. And you say, okay, you can't do that. You can't hit other kids over the head to get what you want. You have to be nice to people, and it'll make life better for you. But you do things to help them because you love them, not because you're trying to make them be what you want them to be. And so the last thing I'll say on this is that, I just think it's better if parents relax more and enjoy this longest relationship you have in your life by watching children become who they are rather than making them be what you want them to be. Oh, sorry, I rabbited on here, but you did ask.
No, it was good. So I think you gave a brief, like not brief, it was very good introduction. I think you answered some of Tana's question. Tana had some question about parenting, but again, I think because it's important, and I saw some of your arguments and talks with different people that they are against that. Some of them, they are like interpreting this differently. But coming to your point about the role of heredity. So because I think it's a little bit misconception in the public, especially about what heredity means in the context of human behavior. In your book, you talked about multiple traits and compared public opinion of UK people to some of the like a research finding, genetic research findings, physiological disease like breast cancer or gastric cancer. On the other side, you talked about autism, school achievement, as well as height and weight. Coming back to what you mentioned, could you please explain why there is a huge gap between the public opinion and what genetic research shows, and how can scientists like you, I know we are educating the people, how we can do it better to educate the public to close these gaps before I go to the next question?
Well, I've been surprised since my book came out about, gosh, it's been 5-6 years now, that when it first came out, I worried how people would react, because some of my friends thought it was a suicide note, basically, that people would get very upset by this. But I had a hunch that things have changed because of the data I talked about. There's a mountain of evidence. Everywhere we look, we find substantial genetic influence. And then the DNA revolution had happened by then. My book came out in, about 6 years ago. So the DNA revolution was well along at that point. So I think people were primed to consider genetic influence. So what surprised me is as I give talks to public groups, I don't get any hostility anymore. And we've done surveys of the public, and the public's estimate of genetic influence on these complex traits is pretty close to what we find. You get some people who still say, oh, there can't be any genetic influence. And there's actually some people who think things are, almost genetically determined, both of which are wrong views. But what's surprising, if you go to academics now, say especially some in the social sciences or in education, you'll still get people who are really anti-genetic. And so I think the media and academia is less in tune with genetics than the public. And especially like teachers, I'm very pleased to see because I study cognitive development, the business end of that is education. And so I'm particularly interested in how genetics is accepted there. And it's interesting to me that there's still a lot of hostility to genetics, but it's more at the level of academia and higher level people in the field. But if you talk to teachers, they say, oh, yeah, of course genetics is important. I don't think you can stand in front of 30 children and teach them a lesson and not realize some kids got it before you open your mouth, and others at the end of the talk, they still need more help to get it. So I think teachers understand that, even though if you look at textbooks for teachers, you won't find anything about genetics other than a few rare single gene disorders that they will never see in their life, probably, even like Williams disease or things that have relevance to learning ability, but they're just so rare. And contrary to what your question suggested about, changing public attitudes, I find that there's very little resistance now to genetics. And in some ways, I find more often I have to worry about going too far the other way, where once you say genetics, then people think of determinism. And it means nothing I can do as a parent. It's all determined. But first of all, it accounts for only 50% of the variance. So right away, the other 50% of the variance is not due to genetics. So that's one thing. And secondly, we're not talking about single gene disorders, many of which you probably study, Mehdi, and those are deterministic. Some of them are anyway. There's thousands of rare single gene disorders that, like Huntington's disease, if you get that dominant mutation, you will die from Huntington's disease. It's hardwired deterministic. And that's how people learn about genetics from Mendel, because he studied single gene mutations, basically. So that's the way people think about it. And it's a lot easier, black and white, you know, do you have the gene or don't you have the gene? So that's what, I think that's partly what we're up against, is once you say genetics, then people start thinking about genetic determinism, and then it moves into fatalism. Oh, well, nothing I can do. So there's a lot more I can say about that, but I'm really rabbiting on here. Partly it's our holiday time here. I'm at my holiday home in Norfolk, which is near the sea, because I like to sail and swim and that sort of thing. So I'm not talking all day long with students and people. So I'm afraid you guys will have to suffer from that.
It's okay. I take a time off from my work today. Tanaz is busy. Tanaz has some other activities.
Yeah, but I'm fine. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk with you. And actually, you already answered a lot of my questions, Robert. But I want to just back to the autism spectrum disorder, the way you've been explaining, talking about that. I have a question about that. So we know that autism, it's known to be highly heritable, but many environmental risk factors have been implicated, as you know. How do you think the interaction between genes and environment plays out in autism?
Well, people want to think about, they want to hear about gene-environment interaction, the idea that, you know, different strokes for different folks and that sort of thing. And there are some examples of that. Like a big area of molecular genetic research is to find therapies that work especially well for individuals with a particular genetic propensity. Like autism isn't one thing, we know that. And so it may be that there are therapies that work better for kids with a genetic risk for this type or that type. And we also know it's not all genetic. So there might be some kids who are autistic for primarily environmental reasons. So couldn't it be that by getting genetic risk for a child, because we know the gene, we can get we call it polygenic risk indicator, we could find kids who are at very high genetic risk. And what you do with them might be different therapeutically than what you do with a kid who has a very low genetic risk for autism. They might be autistic for for environmental reasons, like birth complications. But on the whole, I think when you say there are many environmental risk factors, one thing we have to be careful about is people often find statistically significant factors, first, that don't replicate very often. You look at a bunch of things, you find one that's statistically significant and you make a big deal about it. But the history of those things is that they don't replicate very well. But secondly, and the reason for the first problem, is that people don't think of what we call effect size. It's not enough to say an environmental factor is statistically significant in predicting a risk. You got to say, how much of the variance does it account for? Because in the genetics, I said 50% of the variance. Well, with autism, some people say it's 70%. But if this factor accounts for 0.1% of the variance, if you have a large enough sample, that might be statistically significant. And then people go off and say, okay, that's related to this, to autism. But people don't pay attention enough to effect size. Whereas in genetics, that's the whole game for us. We really need to know how big an effect this is. I know that's a little confusing, but here's an example. People say women are from Venus and men are from Mars, and girls are good at verbal things and boys are good at math things. Well, that's true. That's a statistically significant difference. But then the first question I'd like people to ask is, what about genetics? The second is, what about effect size? How big is this effect size? So, okay, girls are better at verbal stuff than boys. How big an effect is that? Is it, accounting for 30% of the variance between boys and girls? And the answer is it accounts for about 1% of the variance. That is, if you get the distribution of girls, some are good at verbal ability, some are not so good. Get the distribution for boys. You need a very fine-tipped pen to show the difference, because 99% of those distributions overlap. That is, if all you know about a kid is they're a boy or a girl, you really don't know anything about their verbal ability or their math ability. So it's a real problem, I think, in psychology and social sciences in general, that many people and textbooks are loaded with statistically significant findings that are not significant in any socially important way. So sorry about that rant, but it is related to the issue you brought up about environmental risk factors for autism.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's talk about the other mental illnesses, such as like psychopathy, narcissistic, or even other personality disorders like borderline. How significant is the genetic contribution to disorders like this compared to environmental factors?
Right. Well, as I said, you can't find anything in psychology that does not show genetic influence. So one thing you could say without knowing anything about the literature is you could bet that all of those things show genetic influence. And in fact, that's what we find. Some things more than others, you know, schizophrenia and bipolar, autism, ADHD are thought to be among the most heritable disorders. And some of the others that are probably harder to measure, like narcissistic personality problems, for example. But we showed that psychopathy is highly heritable in childhood. If you look at, you know, people use the words psychopathic and antisocial in a very broad way, but it usually involves, in childhood at least, two components. One is, we call it callous, unempathic. So these are the kids who, it's a horrible image, but tear wings off of flies. I mean, they hurt animals or other kids, not because they get pleasure from pain, but it's just, it doesn't affect them. You know, we would go, yuck, why would you do that? But, you know, it doesn't seem to affect them. That's callous, unemotional. And it's an important distinction because if a kid has something they want, they'll knock the kid away to get it. Not because they want to hurt the kid or it's just, I want that, you've got that, boom, you know, get out of the way. The other type is more like delinquency, conduct problems, you know, more antisocial behavior. And there's a theory that says that's normative in adolescence. You know, shoplifting, causing trouble, maybe vandalism, that sort of thing. But this callous, unemotional type goes throughout, it's pretty stable throughout life to adulthood. Whereas the antisocial spike in adolescence drops out after adolescence. And what's neat is the callous, unemotional type is what's driving the heritability of psychopathy. The antisocial thing is not very heritable, and it does show these family environmental influences, which are primarily due to a sibling or friends who, you know, you go out with your friends, they shoplift, you shoplift. You know, it wasn't something you set out to do. So that's a really interesting example of where genetics can help us. But the larger point is that when I say everything's heritable, with psychopathology, like all the disorders you mentioned, recent work in the last 5 years or so shows that in part everything's heritable because the same genes are involved in many disorders. So it's, you know, we look at these things we call phenotypically. You look at the behavioral aspects of them. Like with schizophrenia, there's 4 major types of schizophrenia. And one is hebephrenic. It has to do with emotions. You know, you're just, you look crazy. I mean, you know, you're just wild emotionally. But another type is paranoid schizophrenia, which is more cognitive. You have hallucinations, delusions. Typically, you think people are out to get you. People are telling you to do things over the radio, that sort of thing. And the third type is motoric, and it's called catatonic. It's where for decades before any sort of medications, people would just go like this all day long until they had huge calluses. And then the fourth type is called nuclear or true, which just is none of the above. But actually, all you've done is looked at a bunch of crazy behavior and said, well, this guy primarily has motor. It comes out in motoric behavior. This one comes out in cognitive behavior. This one comes out in emotional behavior. And sometimes it sort of doesn't come out evenly in any of those. But what was really neat is that many years ago at NIMH in the US, there was a study of the Genain, G-E-N-A-I-N, quadruplets, identical quadruplets. So these are genetic clones of one another, as identical twins are. But sometimes you get 3 identical twins. It has to do with the eggs, fertilized eggs splitting in the first few days of life. So you get typically two identical twins with the same DNA. And you can show that at a DNA sequencing level. They have the same DNA, inherited DNA. But then sometimes one of those splits again, and you get 3. And sometimes, very, very rarely, like 1 in hundreds of thousands of times, you get 4. It happens more often than we think because we're not built for multiple births. So often when you have 3 triplets or quadruplets, 1, 2, sometimes 3 of them die often before you even know you had multiple births. But anyway, these quads were born to a schizophrenic mother. And so for, 50 years, NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, studied these quadruplets. And all of them became schizophrenic. But the point here is 1 became hebephrenic, 1 became catatonic, and 1 became paranoid, and 1 was nuclear, which is a pretty good demonstration. They have the same genes. So it's a pretty good demonstration that something environmental probably goes on to say, okay, well, this one has more cognitive problems than this one, but the larger issue is they have the same genetic propensity to schizophrenia, and how it comes out is not due to inherited DNA. It's like, and this is broader than, and the most astounding finding from molecular genetics, where we tried to find genes for these things, and the first 2 biggies were schizophrenia and bipolar. These are called psychoses. These are the worst sort of mental disorders. And so the first large, we call it genome-wide association study, where you look at hundreds of thousands of DNA markers across the genome, and you try to find the genes that affect these traits, like schizophrenia. And this study was done in 2009. And so even at that point, which was, just, 2009, not that long ago, people assumed you'd find 3 or 4 or 5 genes. They knew by then you wouldn't find 1 gene responsible for the heritability, but they thought maybe a handful of genes. But it turns out that the study showed there are hundreds or thousands of tiny DNA differences that are responsible for the heritability of schizophrenia. But then a couple years before, in 2007, the first study was done of bipolar manic depression. So this is, it's called bipolar because you go from the heights of mania, which is, where you really feel crazy and out of control, to the depths of depression. And this is not like you feeling good on a particular day or you feeling a little blue. I mean, we're talking about where you can't really function because you're so crazy. You'll spend all your money, you'll do risky sorts of things, down to depression so bad you don't want to eat, you have trouble sleeping, it's terrible. So that's bipolar. They call it manic depression, mania to depression. So that study was done in 2007. But the amazing thing when the schizophrenia study was done is that the top hits from these association studies were the same. The same genes were involved in schizophrenia and bipolar. And what was amazing about that is at that time, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, which is the sort of the Bible for diagnosing these things, wouldn't allow you to be schizophrenic and bipolar. That's the first division in psychiatry between, okay, these are the, sort of affective disorders, meaning affect, emotion, and these are more the cognitive disorders of schizophrenia. And now, thanks to genetic findings, you can, with the latest version, DSM-5, be both schizophrenic and bipolar. But I mean, it was so weird to pick the one thing that psychiatrists said, these are totally different, schizophrenia and bipolar. And then you find most of the genes for one are genes for the other. And you can now correlate the genes, the thousands of genes that affect schizophrenia, with the thousands of genes that affect bipolar. And it's more technical than this, but basically the genetic correlation is 0.6 So that basically means that if you found a new gene associated with schizophrenia, there's about a 60% chance it's also related to bipolar. So that's at the very top of the diagnostic, or bottom of the diagnostic tree, I suppose. But then all the other disorders now, we're beginning to find they're all genetically correlated. And so now the hot issue in the genetics of psychiatry is to talk about P, little p, which is like a general propensity to psychopathology. And the idea is there's a strong genetic influence on whether you're likely to have abnormal reactions to the stresses of life or whatever it is. But which direction it goes is not really genetically determined. The genes aren't specific in saying an ADHD parent has an ADHD child. An ADHD parent might well have a kid who abuses drugs, but could also be depressed. They're just more likely to have psychopathology. So that's it suggests that the landscape of psychiatry is all wrong. We spend all this time worrying about fine diagnosis, but we've got the basic landscape wrong from a genetic point of view, at least. And it isn't all genetic, I understand, but I think genetics is probably the major systematic force making us who we are. Like you mentioned, the title of my book is DNA, the Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. And I got in a lot of trouble for that title because, what it really should say is DNA, Blueprint, How Inherited DNA Differences Make Us Who We Are as Individuals. So it's not deterministic, but in terms of psychopathology, what it's saying is it's increasing our risk for psychopathology in general, but not specifically. It's such a fascinating finding, I think, and so there's a lot of research done on that area now. But it's another example of how genetics has gone beyond just saying, yeah, genetics is important, which I think was an important thing to say back when people thought just 40 years ago, it's all environmental. And it's mostly what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. So we've gone way beyond that. But it's also such a hot area now. It's kind of revolutionizing psychiatric research.
Okay, thank you so much for all this information, clarification. Actually, you answered my next question already. I was about to ask you if there are any specific genes linked to a higher risk of developing mental illnesses such as borderline, psychopath, sociopath, all this. So you mentioned that, yes, there are specific genes that there's a correlation between these and that, correct, right?
Well, sort of. It's just that it takes a lot of money to do these studies because you've got to study not just 20 schizophrenics. The latest study had, I forget what it is, getting on 150,000 people diagnosed with schizophrenia over the decades. So it involves collaborations among hundreds of research groups who have spent decades studying these individuals and getting diagnoses. And now you then have to get DNA, and then you have to genotype the DNA. And then you have to analyze this huge amount of data. So this is really big science research. So given that, as NIMH, where would you put your money? You're going to put it into the big ones, dementia, but in psychiatry, more you put it into schizophrenia, bipolar. Now, people are studying all the other disorders, but in general, the sample sizes aren't large enough to detect these tiny effects. Do you remember before I was talking about effect size, and I just mentioned that a tiny effect can be statistically significant if you have a large sample. But now, if you don't have a large sample, you will not detect the tiny effects. And so what we've learned, the first GWAS study in biology was this one done in 2007 by the Wellcome Trust, called the Wellcome Trust Case Control Consortium Study. And they studied 7 common disorders, only one of which was psychiatric, and that was bipolar, as I mentioned. But the other things they studied were common medical disorders, like cardiovascular disease. And they found some significant findings, but what they were shocked by is how few they found. And then they saw, when they applied that to other samples, to independent samples, they accounted for just very tiny amounts of variance. That is, the effect size was very small. So then based on what I said, you could see why they realized then that they were going to have to roll up their sleeves and do much larger studies. That study involved 2,000 cases of each of those 7 common disorders. And at the time, people thought, that's overkill. I mean, these guys had too much money. They didn't know what to do with it to get 2,000 cases. But now it turns out 20,000 cases wouldn't get you a publication. And really, the currency is hundreds of thousands. So because the bigger the sample size, the smaller effects you find. And we just don't find any large effects. I mean, it would have been nice to find a few very large effects and turn them over to people like your companies. They said, you know, you can begin to do gene therapy and editing. But that's going to be really hard to do when the biggest effect sizes for these complex disorders is on the order of 0.01% of the variance. That's 0.001 of the variance, not 1%, not 10%, 0.0001. I mean, these are incredibly tiny effects. But the biggest development in the last 10 years is you can put those tiny effects together in what we call a polygenic score. And you can get one number then that represents your overall genetic risk. Now, for people like Mehdi who want to do the gene brain behavior pathways and, you know, psychopharmacological and gene editing sorts of interventions, that's going to be tough because, you know, if you got thousands of genes, they're not working in simple pathways in the brain. This is going to be incredibly complicated at the brain level, but, you know, lots of people will do that. I'm interested, though, just in the ability to predict. You know, from a psychology point of view, there's a lot you can do with that. You can study development. And as you were saying before, you could look for gene-environment interactions in terms of therapy. So that's a hot topic now. Say, if you did a large study now in psychopathology, you know, by large, I mean a therapy like a randomized controlled trial of depression therapies, of which there are many around the world, and you're not going to do 100 subjects. These are like thousands of people because you want to say, do people differ in their response to therapy? So you couldn't do a study like that. You'd never get funded if you didn't collect DNA. Because first of all, you want to know, maybe certain therapies like cognitive behavior therapy work better for people, say, who don't have a strong genetic propensity for depression. But maybe people with a high genetic risk for depression, maybe the pharmacological drugs work better. But we don't even know that definitively now. And then you can go beyond that, which types of drug, because all of medicine now is moving into this personalized treatment approach. And, you know, that genetics is perfect for that, because you can say it's not just your overall genetic propensity, but maybe people with these genetic pathways respond differently to certain drugs. So it's such an exciting area of research. And I should mention, while I mentioned medical genetics, that we're not doing anything new in behavioral genetics. We're just following along the work that's being done in medical genetics, because the common medical disorders, which the vast majority of things that kill us, the medical burden in society, is not due to single genes. It's due to these sort of complex problems like cardiovascular disease, alcoholism. I mean, depression is sort of a medical problem too, in a way. A lot of problems GPs see are sort of fundamentally due to depression. So I think we'll see the breakthroughs coming out of medical research. And one of the things we really see is pharmacogenetics, that is looking for genetic differences in drug responses that could then translate into therapy by genetic interactions.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Great response. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. It was great. So I think maybe we will not have time to cover the future of the research in the behavioral genomics or genetics. I think we got a promise from Robert that we have another session. But for now, Robert published a very good review in the JCPP Advanced, at least among others. So he talks about the next 10 years of behavioral genomics research. So I put a link to this review paper because before our next session you may read, and then
Thank you.
Yeah, get familiar with the topics, because we cover some of them today, but we are mostly covering what is covered in the book Blueprint. Robert talks about the future as well in the book, but this is really a scientific review, and both me and Tannaz, we read it and we enjoyed it. I will post it in the description of the YouTube. Tannaz, you are good for now for the questions? I go to the next question.
Okay, could I ask you a question? You raised the issue of public reception of genetics, and there have been surveys done in many countries, but I'm not aware of any survey in any Arab or Persian sort of country. And I was wondering if we did a survey in Iran of, I don't know how you do a survey there, but you know what I mean. If you could do a survey and get honest opinions from people, what we find, say, in Northern European populations is that you ask, how heritable do you think all these traits are? You give them a bunch of traits, and you first have to explain what you mean by heritability. But, people get it. Like, you can talk about eye color, and that's not due to a single gene, for example. But anyway, we find that the extent to which they say traits are heritable is pretty close to their heritability. On average, they get some things wrong, like they think body weight is much less heritable than it is. And people might be surprised to learn body weight is substantially heritable, maybe like 60%, which means of the differences between people in body weight, about 60% of the differences are due to inherited DNA differences. So I wonder, if we did that sort of survey in Iran, what do you think we'd get?
That's a very good question. So in Iran, I haven't seen such kind of survey, at least in a scientific field, but I think Iranians are, I think at least the new generations, they are very aware of the science around them, and also, but I think we need more education. This is what me, Tannaz, and my other colleague are doing for Iranians, to give more awareness about the evidence-based knowledge from the science perspective and also other aspects. But generally speaking, maybe Iranians may follow the same results that you showed in your book about the UK. Maybe still there are some misconception about some of the weight. For example, I talked to even some educated person that say, no, this person has all the control to control his weight or her weight. But when I explain, no, some of them are out of control, some of them are coming from genetics, some of them are, but still there are resistance, because this is coming to my next question about the determinism of the genes, because some of the people are afraid that if we educate them that maybe genetics is a determination and also predetermines, maybe remove some of the encouragement or learning that this kind of work. But I think they will follow the same conception that UK population that you showed in your research, that they have this difference, especially for weight, height, or breast cancer. I think they need some education around us, but still there is a lack of this survey in Iran that hopefully my colleagues in Iran, they can maybe feel that.
Well, one more objective indicator of that is it legal in Iran to send your saliva saliva sample to a direct-to-consumer company? Is it legal?
I think it's legal, but I think it has to go. I'm out of Iran for almost 15 years right now. Right. Maybe the regulations already changed, but when I was in Iran, if it is really a contract, like collaboration between researchers, maybe company, I'm not sure. But if it was a collaboration between a research institute with a research institute in Iran, so it is legal, and they send the saliva or blood. We have done this before, even myself. But the company, I'm not sure. This kind of should go to a review panel maybe, and then because the genes or the information of the cells going out of Iran, so I'm not sure, but it's possible, because if it's an agreement, it's possible.
Right. Well,
but this is an interesting population. Iranians are interesting population because it's a very diverse population. You see, in a small area of a geographic area, there are many people with different ethnic backgrounds. So I know there are lots of population genetics is happening in Iran. So Robert, I think you covered part of this, but because of the importance of this, I would like to highlight and see your opinion about you mentioned about Huntington disease, the Mendelian or monogenic disorders, that they are, patients are destined to develop the disease, or in some cases they will die. And these are rare. You covered in your book and also in your talks that these are rare diseases that 1 to million or 1 to 100,000 something, that we are not dealing with these disorders in behavioral genetics. We are dealing with the more common one. But I would like you to speak about this to remove any confusion in the public, that when you explain about the role of genes of human behavior, or behaviors are predestined to the genes, or how the environment can help people to control their destination. This is important, I guess, when I talk to my colleagues, to my public, to friends. So this is something they ask us, how deterministic is genes? Because last week I was, me and Tanaz, we interviewed Dr. Sapolsky, and then, you know, he recently published a book, Determined, sorry. And then he think maybe beyond the genes, there are other factors that comes outside from the environment that even those are not under our control. That's a separate topic that we can discuss maybe next session. But just please focus on the genes, that they are not deterministic.
Yeah. Well, that's true in many ways, that they're not deterministic, in part because we're not dealing with single genes. But, you know, even at a single gene level, the essence of sexual reproduction is a random combination of genes from your mother and your father. So randomness actually comes in very early on. It's a large part of what genetics is about. And I disagree, actually, with Sapolsky about determined. I'm coming more and more to think that randomness is really a key factor. You know, that it's amazing that heritability of complex traits are 50% heritable when you realize that DNA was half of the chromosomes from your mother, half from your father, in that first cell with which you began life. And that DNA is in all the trillions of cells in your body. As your body goes through these amazing changes, it's kind of, I think it's almost mind-boggling to think that any genetic differences from that first cell can make a difference in the end in this adult functioning human being with all that complexity. So increasingly in science, people are thinking about stochasticity and the idea that there's noise of all these biological systems. And so it's almost amazing that it's not all noise, but that's what evolution is about, is to secure these signals that break through this complexity, and not just during your reproductive age, you know, getting older now. I find it amazing that we're not all demented and completely falling apart, you know, because at 70, you know, evolution didn't have much to do with us anymore. I mean, it was more about reproductive fitness, yet we're coasting through in fairly good shape. I mean, you know, when you get older, you start to pay attention to all the aches and pains and the memory lapses and things like that. But actually turn it around and you say, it's just amazing we can still talk and think, you know, given the complexity of these biological systems. Can I mention one thing? I'm just so blown away with this Science article about a month ago, you know, in the journal Science. And did you hear this one about that? It was about a sample of a woman's hippocampus that's the size of a grain of rice. Tiny, tiny sample. And they sliced it in 1,000 slices. And they used AI and, you know, dozens of researchers. It was a huge project to try to reconstruct that tiny, tiny bit of hippocampus. And as the title of the paper says, they found 57,000 cells and 150 million connections in a grain of rice. So now you think about these 2-pound brain or so, you know, it just is mind-boggling to think. I mean, people do say it's the most complex thing in the universe.
Exactly.
And I can believe it. And so when you start thinking that way, first of all, you're amazed that children are born mostly normal. I mean, we pay attention to the abnormalities, but it's amazing they're mostly normal. And second, at my end of the lifespan, you start thinking about it's amazing that we still function so late in life. But I do think we need to give randomness more of its credit, because throughout science now, randomness is a very hot topic. I mean, cosmology, for example, that's the idea behind quantum mechanics in a way that randomness is important. It's fundamental, I mean, not just important. So anyway, I disagree with Sapolsky, and it matters in a way because I just, I think it's a mistake telling people it's all determined. So, but I know he's looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, which is a very broad perspective. And whereas I'm looking at it in a fine-grained way at the level of differences between people. And, I think if a alien came from outer space, you might look at all us humans and say, oh, they're all pretty much alike. I can't tell one from the other. But, it's a big deal to us.
So I think that the discussion reached to this point. This was not, didn't want to ask this, but because I asked about your research from Professor Sapolsky, that how he sees about the polygenic score, like in the behavioral genetics, he was okay with what you are doing, but he says he's talking a lot about the context. For example, I think there was some of the interviews you had before, some of the people asked you this, that these results should be applied to only, for example, the UK population when the samples come from the UK. But if you take sample from an African country that they are living in the desert, maybe gives you maybe different polygenic score. And how diverse this. I think you agree with Professor Sapolsky that also, but I mentioned that in the genetic field, there are samples from, I think you said about 1 million sample right now that comes from different countries.
And China is developing huge samples for that reason.
So I think that's may cover part of the
it's not a failing, though. It's just that the research was done, as I said, like in schizophrenia. These are researchers have been doing work for decades. Well, if you're in Norway, who are you going to study? You're going to study Norwegians, obviously.
Exactly.
And so the samples that were brought together were mostly Northern European, US, maybe Australia, a little bit of Southeast Asia, none from Africa. But it wasn't because of bias or prejudice.
Exactly.
It's just that's all that was available. But now a lot of money is moving towards getting samples. Like in Southeast Asia, there's a huge amount of work done. Africa is difficult because there's such great heterogeneity. It's not enough to say Africans. You can't even say Nigerians. You can't even say West Nigerians. I mean, they're genetically more heterogeneous than most populations for evolutionary reasons that we could go into. So I do want to emphasize that people who don't like the genetics, they say, oh, well, it only applies to Northern Europeans. Well, that's for now, but that's a big deal. I mean, if I can predict 15% of the variance in how well kids will do at school on these national exams from DNA alone, knowing nothing else about the kids. And that is a big deal. Okay, if we apply it to Northern Europe, they work pretty well. But if we apply it to Southeast Asia, they work a bit less well. And if we apply it to African samples we have, they work somewhat less well. It's not nothing, but it's not much. But I do want to emphasize it's not because of discrimination. It's just historical. And instead of celebrating the fact that I can explain 15% of the variance in the UK, which is quite heterogeneous in some ways, that's a big deal. And in fact, that's the population I want to predict. So that's good enough for my purposes.
Yeah, it's a big deal. I think he was not against it. He was just saying that because of the limitations that sampling has. But you said, I think the funding is going to the consortium or kind of international, like multinational, like a research to bring samples from around the globe that maybe these results from the Northern Europe will be reproduced in a larger sample as well. But so
along those lines, could I say one more thing? I'm particularly interested in when you do those studies that I bet we'll find some genes that are the same in all and whatever we call them now, ethnicities, ancestral groups, or whatever we call them. And that's kind of neat, kind of universal genetic effects. And then the genes that differ might be interesting too. Certainly biologically, but also maybe evolutionarily or whatever. So, we're all gung-ho for that, for research from as broad groups as, we can get. The problem is you need large samples. So it doesn't pay to get a few hundred of these people and a few hundred of those people. You've really got to be there with tens, if not hundreds of thousands. But it'll happen because again, medicine's driving this. And in America, where you might expect people to be very race conscious because of their slave history, it's the minority populations that are saying, wait, what about us? You know, the Hispanics and the Africans and Caribbeans. You know, you're finding all this information about genetics, but they're from white ancestral groups. And so it's not as if the minority groups are worried about it. They're only worried that they're missing out on a medical revolution.
Thank you, Robert. Just for the, I think for the audience, so we will cover more about the consequence of this kind of findings, like scientific findings in the real world.
1 minute, okay? Just 1 minute.
Sure. Just for the audience, so we will explain more about the consequence of these findings, the positive or even some of the might be negative if there is any negative in the next interview that we will have with Robert. But for this session, we are only covering the basic topics that he covered in his book. But I'm sure for the next session that we have, those are also very important. So we will cover maybe some part of questions. I think Robert, I know he mentioned that he postponed publication of this book for around 40 years, or 35, 40 years, because of the situations that maybe the public were not ready to read these kind of books and look at the DNA because of the events that happened during the World War II, Nazis, or this kind of eugenics. So we'll cover this maybe in the next session because those are also important topics. But for this session, we only cover maybe the most science and most basic aspects of his book. Tannaz, you have a question maybe about the nature of
Yes,
nature. That's
actually, yeah, I want to go back to the book Blueprint, Robert. When you talk about nature of nurture, there is a term you used, you label it as non-shared environmental factors. So could you please explain it more? Actually, I teach lifespan developmental psychology at college, and I've been using this term there, and students been asking me more questions about this. I really appreciate if you just give us more explanation. Thank you.
Yes. Well, it's another one of the big findings in behavioral genetics, and it's counterintuitive and it's difficult for people to understand. So I'm glad you raised this question, because when we talk about nature and nurture, we mean inherited DNA differences, but nurture, we generally mean family environment, basically parental influences. Now, if the parents are so important, as developmental psychologists always assumed, then two children in a family have the same parents. So we call that a shared environmental effect. Now, parents might treat their kids differently. That's not studied so much. But about until 10, 15 years ago, 95% of all developmental studies of parents and offspring studied one child per family, because they assumed that, well, these parents are authoritarian or authoritative, or the different categories of parenting, and different children would have the same parent. So why study more than one child? But that assumed that it's this shared family environment. And the amazing thing is, although environmental influences account for about half of the variance on average, genetics accounts for about half. The other half is not genetic in the inherited DNA sense. So we call that environment. But people assume, yeah, sure, that's parenting. But then what we found is that the genetic evidence, when you take genetics into account, you find that that environment is not due to shared environmental factors. And the simplest way to see that is with adoption studies. So the twin study compares identical and non-identical or fraternal twins. Identical twins are 100% similar genetically, as we said. Other fraternal twins, like any brother and sister, are 50% similar genetically. So the twin method says if it's heritable, then identical twins should be more similar than fraternal twins. And you can use that difference between identical and fraternal twins to estimate how important is genetics. But a simpler and more powerful design is the adoption design. So if twins are like a biological experiment in a way, the adoption is like a social experiment. I'm sure everyone knows that, especially in the 70s, there was before contraception was widely available, it turns out that there were a lot of babies up for adoption. And so a biological parent is as genetically related to their child that they give up for adoption as any parent is, 50% similar. But then that child grows up in an adoptive home where the child is not genetically related to the parent, but that child experiences that family environment. So if the resemblance, say for obesity or body weight, if parents and offspring correlate about 0.4 or so, correlation from 0 to 1. So 0.4 is a substantial correlation. People always assume that's nurture, which makes really good sense for body weight because parents give the kids their food. They decide what they eat. So it makes good sense. But it turns out the correlation between birth parents and their adopted away children is just the same as it is for parents who rear their own children. So, and then conversely, the correlation between the weight of adoptive parents and their adopted children is 0. So even though, say, heavier adoptive parents are giving their kids high-calorie sorts of meals or whatever, the kids aren't getting fatter as a result of that. So there's a huge amount of research in this area, and it all converges on the idea that environment's important, but it's not the environment we always thought was important. It's not this nurture, shared, systematic effects of the family. Whatever it is, it's making two kids growing up in the same family as different from one another as children who grow up in different families. And one more simple piece of data that helps people understand is identical twins reared apart. That's an adoption study. So you take these genetically identical individuals, and rarely, but sometimes, they're adopted separately, especially many decades ago when it was hard to adopt children and no one wanted to adopt two children. So there were cases, especially in Sweden, for example, we found 150 pairs where they had been separated early in life and raised in different families. Those twins, identical twins in different families, are almost as similar as identical twins reared together in the same family for body weight, for personality, for psychopathology. So I think people can see then that it's pretty hard to push the case for shared environment. And that's the converse of the identical twins reared apart is nowadays about a third of adoptive families adopt a second child. So there's two adopted children in the family. They're genetically unrelated to one another. And yet those adopted children are reared in the same family. What's their correlation for, say, body weight or personality? 0. Growing up in the same family doesn't make them similar. So the bottom line of all of this is, it's hard to believe for most people when they first hear this, but what I'm saying is that if you had been mixed up at birth in the maternity room and the wrong parents took you home, I would say you'd be much the same person that you are today, as much as if you had an identical twin who had been reared apart from you. And that's as much as identical twins reared together. So it really is mind-boggling, and it leads to the question, well, what is this non-shared environment? And the short answer is nobody knows. But this is where I think randomness and stochasticity come in. I think it could be like accidents, illnesses, systematic factors. And people have studied that, doesn't seem to account for much. So I think this is where randomness plays an important part. Almost the noise of biological systems. It's not, it's that sort of randomness at a very fundamental level of noise. And this is what goes against the idea of determinism, which is, why I kind of object to the theme of Sapolsky's book. But, I know where he's coming from, and I think it's a brilliant book.
Yeah. So I think he thinks on other aspects as well. So he thinks even the environment, that non-shared environment, that everything that comes out of our home the effects are, I think you discuss in your book that our kids, they go with their friends, they sleep over,
Yes.
they go to the school under different teachers. Those are the non-shared environment that make them different from each other. But Sapolsky is looking at even those effects as also as a causality and cause and effect. So I think that's a separate discussion. But to Tanas, maybe you have another question about the
Actually,
parenting.
I was about to ask about parenting styles like authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, neglectful, but he already covered all these. So I got all my answers, Robert. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, there's one more bit to that, though, that really follows from your question, Mehdi, about people selecting environments correlated with their genetic propensities. That's a somewhat different issue. It's not randomness in the sense. The two of the most important findings about the environment from genetics, which we didn't get from a century of environmental research, we didn't get it from environmental research because they ignored genetics. But if you take genetics into account, the first finding is this non-shared environment, that the environment's important, but it's not what we thought it was. The second is what we call the nature of nurture, the idea that there's genetic influence on our experiences. Just like your example, musically oriented kids hang out with other musically oriented kids. They didn't make our target child more musical. He selected them for that reason. And so he's selected environments correlated with his genetic propensities, which means it's like a virtuous cycle. You know, you get more from the environment. If you've ever seen these, you know, like really gifted children early in life, and there have been studies of them, like Charlesworth at Minnesota followed really bright kids around. He was an environmentalist, but how did he get the bright kids? Well, he studied super bright parents, and he knew that on average, those kids would be pretty bright. And then he studied those that not only were bright, but even in the first few years of life, you know, people say, whoa, who is this kid? And, you know, it's just amazing that what it is it's not that it's hardwired in their brain. They didn't have big vocabularies when they were born. It's how they use their environment. And a striking example was, you know, one of the kids is taken into a room and the guy asked, well, what do you notice about this room? He said, have you ever noticed the angles in the corner of the room? This is like a 4-year-old, you know, and so he's getting so much more out of his environment. And I think that's what teachers tell you too, you know, that where the genetics comes in is how kids use their environment. And I think now that we have sort of infinite access to information, it's not what your teacher gives you, it's the internet. You know, and there's these math programs, the Khan programs, that really maximize this. Let kids go as far and as fast as they want to go. So that's a way of using your environment to foster your genetic propensities. And that's why I say parents need to give their kids opportunities to find out what they like to do and what they're good at, and help them do that. So I think it all kind of fits together. But so in summary, then there's these two major environmental findings that wouldn't have happened without genetic research. The first is non-shared environment. It's really important for parents to know, because if it is the random sort of effects, it means they don't have control over them. So not only do they not have control over the genetics, they don't have control over the environment either, in that long-term sense of creating individual differences that involve mental health and cognitive abilities and that sort of thing. And the second finding is this nature of nurture, which is, I think, kind of important at a sort of fundamental level of understanding ourselves, that, you know, we should try to foster our genetic propensities. And, you know, like well, I won't go on and on about that. But,
so Robert,
it is an important topic.
Is it great? So because of the importance of this topic, I follow up with another question that Thanos asked about the parenting. This is a very, sometimes it's hard to digest by some people. Like, parents matter, but they don't make a difference in their children's life. So we are explaining, I explained this in the episode, but still lots of questions came to me that, so it's not just parents sit there and not doing anything, just let the kids grow without pushing. I think Thanos gave me an example from one of her students that says, okay, maybe Thanos, there's a good example you can mention.
Yeah,
That maybe that's an experience that maybe how Robert can interpret this example.
Yeah, Robert already covered that part. That's why I didn't ask.
Okay.
But I had a student last semester. She was like, I wish I had authoritative parents that she or he push me and ask me, you have to go to college and continue education. Because at the time she was like, now I think she said 30 something years old in my classroom and just taking some general courses, hopefully finish her like certificate, doing something in her life. So the way that you say, I think Mehdi was trying to cover is like, as a mom or dad, it's better to just do something and push our kids in a certain way and just hopefully help them to be successful later in their life. And Robert already covered that. So it's better to be authoritative parent, that we can help our kids, but we don't have to just push them and ask them, you have to go these certain ways. We have to just let them go whatever they like to do and be there to support them. Right, Robert? This is what you say.
Yes, that's basically right. I think it's a danger if parents push too hard. And what's really with university educated parents is, not all kids are going to do well at university, even in the same family. The average IQ difference between two people taken at random in the population, just walk down the street, pick two people, give them an IQ test. The difference between them is 17 IQ points. Now, the average in the population is 100. The average IQ of kids who enter university is about 115 or so, 117. So the average difference between two people is the average difference between people at average in the population and those that go to university. That's a big difference. But the average difference between two siblings in a family, these are 50% genetically related, is about 12 IQ points. So there's big differences, between kids in the same family. And that's sort of on average. But, at the extremes, you'll get some families where one kid, in terms of their polygenic score for school achievement and IQ, where some are very high and some are very low. And now if you were the parent of those two kids and you weren't aware of that, like me and my sister never did well at school and she didn't like school. She was slow to read. That wasn't her thing, academia. And yet, she got lower self-esteem and stuff because people said, well, your brother did so well. What's wrong with you? You must be lazy or something like that. But no, she just really would even admit she doesn't have that academic capacity. Turns out she's very good. She's head of a blood lab, at a hospital where these are life and death decisions. She likes to work with her hands and she likes precision. She wants, she's not thinking abstractly about how she could develop a better technique for this analysis of this bit of blood. But, she's found her niche in life. But up until then, when she went to a technical school to learn hematology sort of thing, she really felt like a loser, because I found school so easy. So parents need to recognize that children in the same family are very different. And as I say, it's hard for us university educated parents to realize that even includes going to university. It really isn't for everybody. And you could force them to do it, but then what's the point? They end up like my sister, just failing. And that can't be good. So,
and that exactly, I agree with you. The thing is, we have an issue in Iran, in Iranian culture, Persian culture, is like most parents, they like their kids to go to law school, medical school, or just become an engineer. So we are trying through our podcast to change this mentality, this attitude. Hopefully we can do something, hopefully, because as you said, maybe some kids, they're not just good at the schools. Some, they really like to go medical school. They want to become physician, but some, they don't want that. But we do have parents, they say, you have to become a physician. You have to become an attorney just because I say so. The authoritarian parenting aside, we have a lot in Iran, unfortunately. So, but we are trying to make some changes, hopefully soon.
And younger people are rebellious, aren't they? I mean, at some point, they're going to not accept that, do you think? Or are we still a long way from that sort of libertarian approach? I mean, you know, I imagine with my kids, we had to be very careful. With my sons especially, I found if I said X, like I said, you must take piano lessons because a civilized person can read music. So as soon as I say, you must do this, you could see them saying, no way am I going to do that. You know, so I had to be very careful about, you know, having them have fun with it, you know. So
exactly.
So I wonder when young Iranian people are going to reach that point.
Yeah, I think the new generation is actually like, say, like my kids, if they say, no, mom, we don't want to do that, I don't push them just because I say so, you have to follow my direction. No, I'm not kind of like that, because time to time I ask my kids, they say, how do you see as a mom, as a parent, am I like authoritative or authoritarian? And I'm so happy and glad to hear that, mom, you're gonna try to just stay authoritative. So that's
Would that go as
awesome.
far as them saying, I want to do art?
Yeah, even I say, even if you want to go, you want to do art, just try to just do your best, whatever you want to be. Even if you want to become a singer, try to be one of the good ones. You know,
Right.
whatever
Well,
you want to do, just do your best.
well, you're more advanced than me on that score because I had a son who's a grandson who's a very good artist and he loves art, but he's also good at math and physics and chemistry. So I'm telling him, you know, keep the day job, get a job where you've got enough money to do the art you want to do. And that works with him because he inherited this orneriness from my side of the family, so that he doesn't like doing art at school because they make you do, you know, now you have to do this, you have to draw this tree. So he's much more of a free spirit on the art. So I say, well, you're never going to make money that way, probably. You're not going to make a living, but you can make a lot of living, you know, if you move into, he's probably going to do architectural engineering design sort of stuff, you know, which combines his interests a little bit. But then I say, then you do whatever art you want to do on the side and you'll have enough money that you don't have to worry about doing art to make a living. So, but I admire your perspective on it.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, I think we can gradually stop here. So following what you asked, Robert, the Iranian new generation kind of covered that. They are more exposed to the outside compared to my time when I was a teenager or I was younger. So they know the world. They are going to know the Western society, the kind of human rights, these kind of things. So they don't accept all the parents are saying to them. In our time, maybe our parents said, okay, you have to be this or you have to be that. I think, but now new generations are aware. Hopefully this kind of podcast also helps the parents as well, so they can maybe be more relaxed and just support the kids instead of doing authoritarian. So I think, yeah, we covered a lot. So I think, I hope that all the audience, they enjoyed. So we covered about the basics of human, like a behavior, like a genetic behavior, nature or nurture. So I had a question about the spectrum of the disease. You mentioned in your book how we look at the mental disease, but we can cover that in the next session. But at the end of this session, Robert, do you have anything to add? In the next session, we can cover some of the consequences of this kind of findings that Robert covered in his book. I mentioned about eugenics, like there are some concern or kind of neo-Darwinism or kind of right side, like right wing, like kind of beliefs that I think I'm sure that Robert is aware of some of them. Maybe we can cover about those, and I would like also to cover about epigenetics, because epigenome is also important, how the environment is interacting with genes. I think we can keep those for the next session. But Robert, if you have anything at the end of this session, feel free.
No, it's just that if some of the listeners have questions, they might then that would be fun to respond to some of their questions as well.
This is not a live event, Robert, so I think we can collect all the questions in the comments in our podcast, also YouTube, and then we can maybe cover that in the next session that we have maybe in a month or so. And then I'm sure we will get a good feedback. Our main audience are Iranians, so we place a Persian caption for this video. But of course, some English speakers also will watch, but we look at the comments and maybe we can bring to you all of those comments for the next session.
Right.
And we can cover.
Like
yeah, I think I really appreciate your time. I know you are on vacation. Maybe you said maybe today, but anyway, I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And it's a great pleasure for me to be with you. And I hope to see you soon. Tanna, do you have anything to add?
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your knowledge, for everything.
No.
Hope to have you here again soon. I appreciate it.
It was a great pleasure meeting both of you and talking with both of you. Good luck for the podcast.
Thank you so much.
We in about a month or so.
Sure, of course. I will reach you by email. We can arrange for another follow-up session. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.